The sirens were still ringing in my ears when I stood at the police station desk, watching them walk away. My own family. My brother's hand on Mom's shoulder, guiding her out like he was the hero of this story. And there it was, Grandpa's bronze star, lying in a clear plastic evidence bag next to a stolen bicycle and someone's lost wallet. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a frequency that made my teeth ache, or maybe that was just the tension radiating through my jaw. I could smell the institutional cleaning solution mixed with stale coffee and something indefinably sad, the scent of broken promises and bureaucratic indifference. The officer looked at me with pity, and I wanted to scream that I wasn't the crazy one, but maybe I was. Maybe spending 43 years trying to be the daughter they wanted had finally broken something inside me. My reflection in the glass partition between me and the officer showed a woman I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, thin-lipped, shoulders curved inward as if protecting organs that had already been damaged beyond repair. 3 months earlier, everything was still holding together. Barely. I was sitting in my kitchen in Phoenix, the one with the yellow walls I'd painted myself because Mom said it would make the house feel cheerful. The paint had seemed like such a good idea at the time, bright, optimistic, the color of hope and new beginnings. Now it just reminded me of caution tape, a warning I should have heeded but didn't. The coffee was cold in my hands, and I was staring at my phone, reading a text from my cousin Linda. She wanted to know if the rumors were true. "What rumors?" I asked. She didn't respond. That was the first crack, though I didn't recognize it yet. I thought maybe she'd sent it to the wrong person, or maybe I was reading too much into things. I remember setting the phone down and staring at those yellow walls, noticing for the first time how the paint had started to peel near the ceiling in one corner. A small imperfection I'd been ignoring for months, maybe years. Isn't that how it works? You ignore the small cracks until they become fissures, until the whole structure threatens to collapse. I got up and touched the peeling paint with my fingertip, and a larger piece flaked off into my hand. I held it there in my palm, this tiny fragment of optimism that had dried up and fallen away, and something inside me whispered that this was an omen. But I was good at ignoring omens. That's what I did back then. I made excuses for everyone except myself. My brother Derek had always been the golden child. Mom used to say he had Dad's business sense, even though Dad had been a mailman who died when we were kids. The irony of that statement never seemed to register with her, that she was attributing business acumen to a man who delivered mail for 23 years and left us with $8,000 in life insurance and a mortgage that nearly swallowed us whole. But facts didn't matter when it came to Derek. He'd been anointed early, and once that happens in a family, the narrative is set in stone. Derek worked in real estate now, and he wore suits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Italian wool, probably. The kind of fabric that whispers money when you move. He had this way of walking into a room like he owned it, like the rest of us were just background actors in his personal movie. His stride was measured, confident, the walk of someone who'd never been told no in any way that mattered. And me? I was the supporting character who kept the set running. I organized the family dinners, remembered everyone's birthdays, kept Grandpa's house clean after he passed. I sent cards for anniversaries and graduations, bought presents for nieces and nephews, showed up early to help set up and stayed late to clean up. I was the glue, the emotional infrastructure, the person nobody noticed until I wasn't there. I thought that's what love looked like. Sacrifice with a smile. Service as a form of belonging. I didn't realize until much later that I'd confused being needed with being valued, and those two things are oceans apart. The whispers started small. Derek mentioned to Aunt Carol that I seemed stressed, that maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. I know this because Aunt Carol told me later, after everything fell apart, after she'd had time to reflect on how the poison had spread. She said Derek had pulled her aside at a family barbecue, his voice low and concerned, his hand on her elbow in that way that signals intimacy and confidence. He'd shaken his head sadly and said he was worried about me, that I'd been acting strange around Grandpa in his final months. He suggested, just suggested mind you, that perhaps I'd been trying to influence the old man about the will, planting seeds about who deserved what, who'd been more attentive, who'd sacrificed more. He told Uncle Mike that I'd been making odd financial decisions, hinting at instability without ever saying anything concrete enough to be challenged. None of it was true. But here's the thing about lies. They don't need to be true to do damage. They just need to be repeated enough times. And Derek was very good at repetition. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People believe what they hear most often, especially when it comes from someone they trust. And everyone trusted Derek. He was successful, articulate, confident. He looked like someone who had his life together, so surely his observations must be accurate, right? Have you ever watched someone rewrite your story while you're still living in it? It's like drowning in slow motion, reaching for air while everyone around you insists the water isn't real. I found out about the medal on a Tuesday. Tuesdays had always been my least favorite day. Not dramatic enough to be Monday, not hopeful enough to be Wednesday, just there, gray and forgettable. Mom called me, which was unusual because we usually texted. Our relationship had devolved to emojis and brief updates, the kind of low-effort communication that signals emotional distance neither party wants to acknowledge. Her voice had that tight quality it got when she was trying to stay calm. I could picture her in her living room, the one Dad had painted blue before he died, standing by the window with the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand probably clutching the edge of the curtain. She said Derek had taken Grandpa's things to the police station because they'd found some questionable items in the house. Questionable items. The phrase hung in the air between us, absurd and terrible. That's what she called a bronze star from World War II, a watch that still worked, and a set of letters Grandpa had written to Grandma during the war. Derek told them it was probably stolen property because Grandpa couldn't have afforded such things on his pension. The logic was insane. A war medal? Stolen? But Derek had presented it with such confidence, such concern for doing the right thing, that the police had accepted it at face value. The police were just doing their job, she said. They were holding the items until someone could prove ownership. Her voice was apologetic but firm, already accepting Derek's narrative as truth. I drove to the police station that afternoon. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I kept replaying Mom's words, trying to make them make sense, failing. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I had to consciously relax them at every stoplight. The Phoenix heat shimmered off the pavement in waves, distorting the cars ahead of me, making everything look unreal. Maybe that was it, I thought. Maybe I'd fallen asleep in my yellow kitchen, and this was all some anxiety dream my brain was spinning to process stress. The officer behind the desk was young, maybe 25, and he looked uncomfortable when I explained who I was. He had the kind of face that probably looked boyish even when he was trying to be authoritative. Round cheeks, earnest eyes, a name tag that read, Officer Mendez. He showed me the evidence bag, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not metaphorically. I actually felt a physical sensation, like a bone breaking deep inside me. That medal had been on Grandpa's dresser my entire life. It lived in a small wooden box Mom had given him one Christmas, the kind with a tiny brass clasp that clicked when you opened it. He used to let me hold it when I was little. Told me stories about the men he served with, about the fear and the courage and the randomness of who lived and who didn't. I remember being 7 years old, sitting on his bed while he showed me the medal. His hands had trembled even then, some combination of age and memory. He told me about a man named Jimmy Patterson who died saving Grandpa's life, and how the medal felt heavy not because of the bronze, but because of the weight of survivors' guilt. Some people carry their medals with pride, he'd said, his voice gruff with emotion. I carry mine with gratitude and shame, because better men than me didn't make it home. And now it was next to a stolen bike, tagged and numbered like trash. Derek arrived 10 minutes later. He must have gotten a call. He walked in with that smile he used on clients, the one that said he was doing you a favor by existing. Everything about his appearance was calculated. The precisely knotted tie, the watch that caught the light just so, the cologne that probably cost more than my electric bill. He put his hand on my shoulder and told the officer I'd been under a lot of stress lately. That grief made people do strange things. His fingers pressed down just a fraction too hard, a subtle assertion of control, masked as concern. I shook his hand off and asked him directly why he'd done this, why he'd taken Grandpa's things to the police. His expression shifted. Just for a moment, I saw satisfaction flash across his face before it rearranged itself into wounded confusion. He said someone had to be responsible, that I'd been acting erratically, that the family was concerned about my mental state. He said it so smoothly, so reasonably, that even I started to doubt myself for a second. That's the insidious thing about gaslighting. It works even when you know what's happening. The metallic taste of shock filled my mouth, and I realized I was living in a reality I no longer recognized. The officer suggested we handle this as a family matter and return the items to the estate lawyer. Derek agreed immediately. He thanked the young officer for his service, made some joke about public servants being underappreciated, and ushered me toward the door. His hand was on my back now, steering me like I was a child or someone not quite competent to navigate on my own. I let him because I was still in shock, still processing that this was actually happening. Mom was waiting in the parking lot, and she hugged me like I was the one who needed comforting. She smelled like her usual perfume, something floral and old-fashioned that she'd worn my entire life. The familiarity of it made everything worse somehow, a reminder that even home smells can exist in hostile places. She said everything would be fine, that Derek was just trying to protect Grandpa's legacy. I wanted to ask her when protection started looking like theft, but my throat had closed up. All I could do was nod and get in my car and drive home to those yellow walls that didn't feel cheerful anymore. I sat in the driveway for 15 minutes after I got home, unable to make myself go inside. A neighbor walked by with her dog, waved cheerfully, and I waved back on autopilot. She had no idea she was looking at someone whose reality had just fractured. From the outside, I probably looked fine. That's the cruelty of emotional devastation. It rarely leaves visible scars. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Grandpa and the stories he'd told me. He used to say that the hardest battles weren't the ones you fought with weapons. They were the ones you fought with people who were supposed to love you. He'd been estranged from his own brother for years over something similar, though he never told me the details. I'd asked once when I was in high school, curious about why Uncle Robert never came to family gatherings. Grandpa had gotten quiet, stared out the window for a long moment, then said simply, "Some wounds are too deep to heal, honey. Sometimes family hurts you in ways strangers never could." At the time, I thought it was sad, but abstract, the kind of family drama that happened to other people. Now I wondered if he'd felt this same suffocating confusion, this sense that reality was shifting under his feet. I got up at 2 a.m. and made tea I didn't drink, and I asked the empty kitchen if I was losing my mind. The refrigerator hummed in response, which felt about right. I stood there in my pajamas, holding a mug that said, "World's Best Daughter" on it, a gift from Mom years ago, and I thought about throwing it against the wall. I wanted to see it shatter, wanted some external manifestation of the breaking happening inside me. But I didn't. I set it carefully in the sink and went back to bed, where I stared at the ceiling until dawn. I know what you're thinking. You're screaming at your screen, telling me to fight back, to get a lawyer, to expose Derek for what he was doing. I can hear your frustration, and believe me, I felt it too. But here's what nobody tells you about family betrayal. It paralyzes you. Because if you fight back, you're the troublemaker. If you defend yourself, you're the one tearing the family apart. The family myth requires a villain, and if you won't play the victim, they'll cast you as the antagonist instead. So you stay quiet, and you let them rewrite your story, and you start to wonder if maybe their version is the true one. I spent days in this fog of doubt. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining the cruelty in Derek's smile. Maybe grief had scrambled my brain, and everyone else could see it except me. I called in sick to work for 3 days, something I'd never done in 15 years at the insurance company. My boss, Carol, was kind about it, told me to take the time I needed. I spent those days moving through my house like a ghost, noticing all the ways I'd tried to make it a home, and failed. The yellow walls that were supposed to be cheerful, the photos on the mantle of family gatherings where my smile looked increasingly strained, the books on the shelf about finding happiness and living your best life, all the self-help garbage I'd consumed trying to fix whatever was wrong with me, never realizing the problem wasn't me at all. The second chapter of my unraveling came at Mom's birthday dinner 3 weeks later. The whole family was there, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years. Derek had organized it, which should have been my first clue. Derek never organized anything unless it served his purposes. He'd rented out a private room at an Italian restaurant downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and wine lists longer than my arm. Everyone kept commenting on how generous he was, how thoughtful. I sat at the end of the table, next to Cousin Linda and her husband, whose name I could never remember, and I felt like I was watching the dinner from outside my body. Derek stood up halfway through the meal and gave a toast about family unity and supporting each other through difficult times. He looked directly at me when he said it. His eyes held mine for just a beat too long, long enough that others noticed and followed his gaze. Then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that some family members had been struggling with Grandpa's death and making questionable decisions. He didn't say my name, but everyone's eyes found me anyway. I felt the weight of their attention like physical touch, intrusive and assessing. Cousin Linda, the one who'd texted me about rumors, leaned over and whispered that she'd heard I'd been trying to sell Grandpa's things without telling anyone. Her breath smelled like the Chianti everyone was drinking, and her tone was conspiratorial, like she was giving me a heads up about something she'd heard, not accusing me directly. Another cousin, Michael, who I'd babysat when he was little, asked if it was true I'd been at the police station causing a scene. I tried to explain what really happened, but my voice came out wrong, too high, too defensive. The more I tried to sound calm, the more agitated I appeared. It's a special kind of torture, that catch-22 where the act of defending yourself becomes evidence of your guilt. Mom squeezed my hand under the table and told me not to make a fuss on her birthday. Her fingers were cold, and her grip was firm, not comforting, but silencing. So I sat there and smiled and let them think whatever Derek had planted in their minds. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, looking at a woman I barely recognized. My dress was nice. I'd bought it specifically for this dinner, wanting to look put together, successful, stable. Navy blue, conservative cut, paired with Mom's pearl earrings that she'd given me years ago. But the woman wearing it looked haunted. My eyes had developed shadows underneath that makeup couldn't quite hide, and there was a tightness around my mouth that aging and stress had carved there. When had I become this person? This silent, shrinking thing? I splashed cold water on my face, careful not to ruin my mascara, and I made a decision. I'd smile through the rest of the dinner, and then I'd go home and figure out what to do. Because something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, in this state of constant defense, constantly trying to prove I wasn't the person they'd decided I was. That decision felt small at the time, but it was the first step toward reclaiming myself. The sacrifices had started small. I'd given up my scholarship to State University when Dad died, because someone needed to help Mom with the bills. Derek was only 14 then, still in high school, so it fell to me. I was 18 and full of dreams about studying history, about maybe teaching or working in a museum someday. I loved old things, the stories they held, the way they connected us to people we'd never meet. I used to spend hours in antique stores, touching objects and imagining their histories, who'd owned them, what lives they'd witnessed. I remember the day I told my academic advisor I wasn't coming back in the fall. Professor Mitchell had looked at me with such disappointment that I'd almost changed my mind. She'd written me a recommendation letter that called me one of the most promising students she'd encountered in 20 years of teaching. She said I had a gift for making history come alive, for seeing the human stories beneath the dates and facts. When I told her I had to drop out, she tried to find me a work-study position, additional scholarships, anything to make it work. But bills don't care about dreams. So I got a job at an insurance company and stayed local. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary became permanent when Mom got sick a few years later. Nothing life-threatening, but enough that she needed help and support. Then, Grandpa needed help as he aged, his hands too shaky to cook, his mind too foggy to remember medications. Then Derek needed someone to watch his kids while he built his business, and who else was available but me? Before I knew it, I was 43 and still answering phones at the same insurance company, and my dreams had become something I thought about late at night when I couldn't sleep. They'd transformed from possibilities into regrets, from things I might do someday into things I should have done when I had the chance. I'd sacrificed relationships too. There was a man once, Michael, who wanted to move to Seattle for his job. He was an architect, brilliant and kind, with hands that sketched beauty onto paper and a mind that saw possibilities where others saw limitations. He asked me to come with him, said we could start fresh, build something new. I wanted to go so badly I could taste it. I remember the night he asked me. We were sitting on my couch, the one I'd bought secondhand and reupholstered myself, and he had this map of Seattle spread out on the coffee table. He pointed to neighborhoods, parks, coffee shops we could explore together. He painted a picture of a life that felt like waking up after years of sleepwalking. But Mom needed me, and Grandpa was getting frailer, and Derek said it would be selfish to abandon the family. "You're all Mom has," Derek had said, somehow conveniently forgetting his own existence in that equation. "You can't just leave her alone." The guilt had been crushing. So Michael went to Seattle alone, and I got occasional updates through social media until he married someone else and stopped posting things I could see. Sometimes I looked at his wife's profile, a landscape photographer with an adventurous spirit and apparently no family obligations holding her back. I wondered sometimes what my life would have looked like if I'd chosen differently, if I'd been brave enough to want something for myself, if I'd understood then what I know now. That sacrifice without reciprocity isn't love, it's just slow suicide. The family gatherings became harder after Mom's birthday dinner. People's eyes would slide past me, or they'd lower their voices when I entered a room. Derek's wife, Jessica, stopped inviting me to her book club. We'd been meeting monthly for 3 years, discussing everything from literary fiction to mystery thrillers, drinking wine and laughing about our jobs and lives. Then suddenly, radio silence. When I texted asking about the next meeting, she said they'd decided to take a break. I saw on Instagram 2 weeks later that they'd met without me, all of them smiling over glasses of wine, discussing a book I'd recommended months earlier. Uncle Mike didn't ask me to help with the annual yard sale, something I'd done with him for a decade. It was like I was fading, becoming transparent, and nobody seemed to notice or care. Or maybe they noticed and were relieved. Maybe I'd been a burden they were glad to shed, and Derek had just given them permission to cut me loose. I confronted Derek once at a barbecue at his house. It was a beautiful day, Arizona summer just starting to break into fall. The kind of weather that makes you remember why people live in the desert. His backyard was immaculate, of course. Professional landscaping, a pool that sparkled like it belonged in a resort, furniture that cost more than my car. I found him by the grill, flipping burgers with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. I asked him point blank why he was spreading lies about me. He looked genuinely confused, like I'd accused him of something incomprehensible. The spatula paused in midair, and he cocked his head like a dog hearing a strange noise. He said he was worried about me, that everyone was, that maybe I should talk to someone about my paranoia. Then he hugged me, and I felt his satisfaction in the way his hands pressed against my back, in the way he held on just a little too long. He was enjoying this. This was entertainment for him, a game where he controlled all the pieces, and I didn't even know we were playing. I stopped going to family events after that. I told Mom I was busy with work, which was true enough. I'd started taking on extra projects, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the isolation was its own kind of torture. I'd spent my whole life orbiting this family, and now that I was cut off, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. The yellow kitchen walls started to feel like a prison. I thought about painting them a different color, but that felt like admitting defeat somehow, like saying Derek had won. So I left them yellow and tried not to look at them too closely. The curator changed everything. His name was Marcus, and he knocked on my door on a Saturday morning in late September. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't expecting anyone, and human interaction had started to feel dangerous. Every conversation felt like a potential minefield, another opportunity to be misunderstood or misrepresented. But something made me open the door. Maybe the same instinct that makes you answer a phone at 3 a.m., that sense that important news doesn't follow convenient schedules. And there he was, a tall black man in his 60s with kind eyes and a museum lanyard around his neck. He wore glasses that sat slightly crooked on his nose, and he had the comfortable, slightly rumpled appearance of someone who cared more about ideas than appearances. He said he'd been contacted by the Phoenix Police Department about some World War II items they'd recovered, and he'd traced them back to my grandfather through military records. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to donate the Bronze Star to the Arizona Military Museum, where it could be properly honored. I invited him in because I didn't know what else to do, and he sat at my kitchen table and told me things about Grandpa I'd never known. He pulled out a worn folder from his bag, the kind academics carry, stuffed with papers and marked with coffee rings. He'd researched the battle where Grandpa earned the medal, found letters from his commanding officer, discovered that Grandpa had saved 3 men by dragging them to safety under enemy fire. Marcus showed me photographs of young men in uniform, barely more than boys, really. There was Grandpa. I recognized him despite the decades between that photo and the old man I'd known. His face was thinner, harder, eyes looking at something beyond the camera. Marcus showed me documents, a whole history I'd never seen. He talked about the specific battle, the date, the location in Italy, the strategic importance. He showed me the after-action report that described Grandpa's heroism in clinical military language that somehow made it more real. Despite heavy enemy fire, Private First Class, Grandpa's name, exposed himself to danger to retrieve 3 wounded comrades, resulting in their successful evacuation and survival. And then he asked me something that made the world tilt sideways. He asked why the items had been reported as stolen. I started crying, not delicate tears, but the ugly, gasping kind that come from someplace deep and broken. The kind of crying that's more like a physical purge. Your body trying to expel pain through salt water and shuddering breaths. And I told him everything. The whole story spilled out of me. Derek's lies, the family's rejection, the slow erosion of my reality and my relationships. I told him about the police station and the birthday dinner and the isolation that had become my daily existence. I told him things I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet. And Marcus listened. He listened without interrupting, without the skeptical expression I'd become so used to seeing. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a gesture I'd come to learn meant he was processing something important. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said he understood, that he'd been the scapegoat in his own family once, that he knew what it felt like to be erased by the people who were supposed to love you. He told me his story right there at my kitchen table. His sister had convinced their mother he was stealing from her, taking cash, jewelry, sentimental items. It had started when their mother began showing early signs of dementia, and his sister saw an opportunity to consolidate power. She'd isolated him from their mother, turned other family members against him, eventually gotten a restraining order based on fabricated evidence. He said he'd lost 2 years of his life trying to prove his innocence before he finally walked away. He told me that some families are toxic in ways that can't be fixed, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Family research reveals that the scapegoat is often blamed for all problems and attacked by everyone. When he said that, When he validated what I'd been experiencing, something inside me shifted. It was like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through in darkness. Maybe I wasn't crazy after all. Maybe this was a recognized pattern, something that happened to other people, something that had a name and a psychology behind it. The relief was overwhelming and painful all at once. Relief that I wasn't alone, pain that this was a common enough experience to have academic research attached to it. That old photograph turned up a week later. I was cleaning out a closet, something I did when the anxiety got too bad. Physical organization as a proxy for the emotional organization I couldn't achieve. And there it was in a box of college stuff I'd never unpacked. Textbooks I'd told myself I might need someday, syllabi from classes I'd loved, papers with professors' comments praising my insights. And the photograph. It was from my 20th birthday, before Dad died, before everything fell apart. I was wearing a vintage dress I'd found at a thrift store, 1950s style with a full skirt and a pattern of tiny flowers. I'd felt so sophisticated in it, so adult and capable. I was standing in front of the university library with a huge smile. My arms were full of books. I could even read some of the spines in the photo. Roman history, medieval architecture, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. My eyes had this light in them, this excitement about the future. I looked like someone who believed the world was full of possibilities, like someone who didn't yet know how much of herself she'd be expected to sacrifice. I stared at that girl for a long time, and I felt something inside me collapse. Not in a bad way, more like a dam breaking, releasing something that had been held back too long. I missed her. I missed who I'd been before I learned to sacrifice myself for people who didn't care. And I decided, right there in that closet surrounded by boxes of a life I'd never lived, that I wanted her back. Not exactly. I could never be that naive again, and maybe that was okay. But I wanted her spirit back, her hope, her belief that she deserved good things. I wanted to stop living a half-life designed to make other people comfortable. Marcus became my first real ally in what felt like forever. We started meeting for coffee once a week, always at this little place near the museum where they knew his order by heart. Black coffee, no sugar, and a blueberry muffin he never finished but always ordered. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, and it became a haven for me, a place where I could speak honestly without watching every word, without worrying how it would be twisted later. He introduced me to other people he knew who'd been through similar situations. A woman whose brother had stolen her inheritance, a man whose parents had disowned him for refusing to support their lifestyle, a younger woman whose in-laws had tried to take her children away. We weren't a formal group or anything, just people who understood that family could be a weapon wielded by those who claimed to love you. They gave me something I'd been missing: validation. Proof that I wasn't alone, that this kind of betrayal had a name and a pattern. Have you ever felt that relief of finding your tribe? It's like coming up for air after being underwater so long you forgot what breathing felt like. These people understood viscerally what I'd been through because they'd lived variations of the same story. We shared strategies, offered support, reminded each other that we weren't the problems in our families. We were the truth tellers, and that's why we'd been targeted. One woman in our group, Patricia, suggested I start documenting everything. She was in her 50s, a former nurse who'd been systematically pushed out of her family after reporting her brother's medical fraud. She had this brisk, practical manner that I found incredibly comforting. She said I needed to create a paper trail, evidence of what Derek had done and was still doing. So I did. I started keeping a journal of every conversation, every text message, every time someone mentioned a rumor they'd heard. I made copies of the police report about Grandpa's items. I contacted the estate lawyer and asked for records of everything related to Grandpa's will. The documentation process was tedious, but it was also empowering. For the first time in months, I was doing something instead of just enduring things. I was building a case, and I was doing it quietly, carefully, the way Derek had built his campaign against me. Except mine was based on truth. Every time I added an entry to the journal, every time I saved a screenshot or made a copy of a document, I felt a little more solid, a little more real. I was creating a record that said, "This happened. This is true. I am not imagining this." I also started telling people what was really happening. Not everyone, I wasn't stupid, but key people. I told Aunt Carol the truth about the police station incident, showed her the documentation Marcus had given me about the medal. I remember sitting with her in her sunroom, the one with all the plants she babied like they were her children, and watching her face change as she read through the papers. She kept saying, "Oh," and "oh my," in this soft, shocked voice. When she finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm so sorry. I should have questioned it more." I told Linda about the lies Derek had spread and why I'd stopped coming to family events. I reached out to a few cousins Derek hadn't gotten to yet and gave them my side of the story before he could poison them against me. It was terrifying at first. Every conversation felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to be pushed. But slowly, a few people started to listen. Aunt Carol admitted Derek had been acting strange lately, making comments that didn't quite add up. Linda said she'd wondered about the rumors because they didn't sound like me at all. The truth started spreading the way Derek's lies had, person to person, conversation by conversation. There's a kind of power in owning your story, in refusing to let someone else narrate your life. It doesn't fix everything, but it changes something fundamental in you. You stop being a victim and become a witness instead. You stop letting other people's versions of reality override your own experience. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away when I decided to confront them. Our family always did Thanksgiving at Mom's house, the one Derek and I had grown up in. It was tradition, sacred, the one meal where everyone showed up no matter what. I knew Derek would be there. I knew the whole family would be there, sitting around that table like everything was fine, like they hadn't spent the last 6 months treating me like I was unstable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Confronting my dysfunctional family at a dinner meant to celebrate gratitude. But what else did I have to lose at that point? They'd already taken my reputation, my relationships, my sense of self. They couldn't take anything more unless I let them. I planned it carefully. I contacted Marcus and asked him to write a letter explaining the historical significance of Grandpa's medal and confirming that Derek had misrepresented the items to the police. I printed out documentation from the estate lawyer showing that everything had been properly accounted for in Grandpa's will. I made copies of text messages where Derek had spread specific lies, matching them with the timeline of when family members had started avoiding me. I put it all in a folder, and I practiced what I was going to say in front of my bathroom mirror until my voice stopped shaking. Patricia offered to come with me, but I said no. This was something I needed to do alone. Some confrontations are so personal that having witnesses, even friendly ones, dilutes their power. I needed to face them myself, needed to prove to myself that I could stand up and speak my truth even when my voice shook, even when my hands trembled, even when every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet and keep the peace. The night before Thanksgiving, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios, imagining how Derek would react, what Mom would say, whether anyone would believe me. I thought about backing out a dozen times. It would be easier to just not show up, to let them have their perfect holiday without me ruining it. But then I'd think about that girl in the photograph, the one with the light in her eyes and dreams of studying history. She deserved better than this. She deserved someone to fight for her, even if that someone was just the woman she'd become. I arrived at Mom's house at 2 o'clock, the folder tucked under my arm like a shield. The smell of turkey and stuffing hit me when I walked in, and for a second, I was 10 years old again, helping Mom make cranberry sauce while Dad told terrible jokes from the living room. The memory was so vivid it hurt, a reminder of what family was supposed to feel like before death and dysfunction had twisted it into something unrecognizable. Derek was already there, of course, holding court in the kitchen with Jessica and his kids. He saw me and smiled that client smile, asked how I was doing like we were old friends catching up. I smiled back and said I was good, better than I'd been in months. Something in my tone made his smile flicker, but he recovered quickly. That's the thing about manipulators. They're very good at reading people, at sensing when the script isn't going the way they planned. Dinner was excruciating. Small talk about jobs and kids and the weather, everyone carefully avoiding anything real. I pushed turkey around my plate and waited for the right moment. It came when Derek stood to make a toast, because of course he did. He raised his glass and started talking about family, about how lucky we were to have each other, about Grandpa's legacy living on through all of us. That's when I stood up too. The room went quiet. Mom's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Derek's smile froze, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out what I was doing. I took a breath and started talking. I said I wanted to share something I'd learned recently. I told them about Marcus, about the museum, about the real story of Grandpa's medal. Then I told them about Derek taking those items to the police and calling them stolen property. I pulled out the letter from Marcus and read it aloud. I showed them the timeline of Derek's lies and the documentation proving everything in Grandpa's estate had been properly handled. My voice shook at first, but it got stronger as I went. I looked at each person around that table and told them exactly what Derek had done to me. How he'd isolated me, spread rumors, tried to make me think I was losing my mind. I ended by saying I didn't expect everyone to believe me right away, but I wanted them to have the facts. The truth. Something Derek had never given them. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's face had gone white, then red. He started to say something about me being dramatic, about twisting things, but Aunt Carol cut him off. She said she wanted to see the documentation, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Mom was crying. Uncle Mike was yelling at Derek. Jessica was trying to defend him, but sounding less certain with every word. Cousin Linda came over and hugged me, whispered that she was sorry for believing the rumors. Studies show that 1 in 10 seniors experiences some form of abuse every year. Grandpa might have been part of that statistic if the curator hadn't stepped in. It's sobering, isn't it? That realization that we almost lost his legacy to Derek's greed and manipulation. Derek tried to leave, but Uncle Mike blocked the door. He demanded an explanation, and for the first time in his life, Derek didn't have a smooth answer ready. He stammered something about trying to protect the family, about me misunderstanding his intentions. But the evidence was right there on the table, and even his most loyal defenders couldn't explain it away. Mom asked him directly if he'd lied to the police. He said it was complicated. She asked if he'd spread rumors about me. He said people had been concerned. She asked if anything I'd said wasn't true. He didn't answer that one. The silence was all the confession she needed. What happened next surprised me. Mom, the woman who'd always protected Derek, who'd made excuses for him my entire life, told him to leave. She said she was ashamed of him, that Grandpa would have been ashamed of him. Derek tried to argue, but she was done listening. She said he'd betrayed not just me, but the whole family, that he'd poisoned something that was supposed to be sacred. Jessica grabbed her kids and followed Derek out, and we all listened to his car peel out of the driveway. The turkey was cold by then, the stuffing congealed on our plates. But something had shifted in that room, something fundamental. The truth had won, not because it was louder or more convincing, but because it was real. And reality, eventually, has a way of asserting itself. The aftermath wasn't clean or simple. Derek didn't apologize, didn't suddenly see the error of his ways. He doubled down for a while, tried to convince Jessica and his kids that I'd manipulated everyone. But the documentation was too solid, and more family members started remembering things, comments Derek had made, times when his stories hadn't quite added up. His influence crumbled slowly, like a sandcastle being worn away by waves. Mom started calling me regularly again, apologizing for not seeing what was happening sooner. Aunt Carol invited me to Christmas. Linda added me back to the family group chat. It wasn't a complete victory. Some family members still sided with Derek, still believed his version of events. But I didn't need everyone to believe me. I just needed enough people to see the truth that I wasn't alone anymore. The real justice came in quieter ways. Derek's reputation took a hit. People in the family started questioning his business deals, his motivations, his character. He lost the automatic trust he'd always enjoyed, and that bothered him more than any legal consequence could have. I saw him at a family wedding 6 months later, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished. He tried to approach me, maybe to make peace, or maybe to try one more manipulation. I just looked at him and walked away. I didn't need his apology or his explanation. I'd already moved on to a version of my life where his opinion didn't matter. Marcus helped me donate Grandpa's medal to the museum, and they created a small exhibit about his service. I cried when I saw it. The medal in a glass case, the letters, the photographs, the story of what he'd done preserved for people who would never know him but could still appreciate his courage. The museum asked me to give a short talk at the opening, and I did, even though public speaking terrified me. I talked about Grandpa and about the importance of preserving family histories, and I felt that girl from the photograph standing beside me, proud of what we'd become. I started volunteering at the museum after that, just 1 day a week at first, helping with archives and giving tours. But it grew into something bigger. I learned about preservation techniques, about how to research family histories, about the stories objects can tell when we take the time to listen. It filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was empty. I was using my brain again, learning again, connecting with people who valued the same things I did. The insurance company job paid my bills, but the museum fed my soul. And slowly, I started to recognize myself again. Not the girl from the photograph. I could never be her again, and that was okay. But someone new, someone stronger, someone who knew her worth and wouldn't settle for less. I found my tribe in unexpected places. The group of people Marcus introduced me to became genuine friends. We met for dinners, helped each other through hard times, celebrated victories together. Patricia introduced me to her book club, and I discovered I loved discussing literature with people who actually listened to what I said. I started hiking with a group on weekends, rediscovering the desert landscape I'd lived in my whole life but never really seen. The saguaros at sunset, the way the rocks glowed red in the right light, the surprising resilience of desert flowers that bloomed after rain. I even started dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee with a guy from the museum who made me laugh and didn't make me feel like I had to be anyone other than myself. His name was David, and he was a retired teacher who volunteered cataloging military letters. He had gentle hands and a quick wit, and he treated me like my opinions mattered. We took it slow. I wasn't ready to rush into anything, and he respected that. My tribe wasn't the family I was born into. It was the family I chose, and that choice felt like the most powerful thing I'd ever done. Before I finish my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. Something that might help you if you're going through something similar. Being a scapegoat isn't random. It follows patterns, and understanding those patterns can help you recognize what's happening before it destroys you. The scapegoat is usually the most empathetic person in the family, the one who tries hardest to keep the peace. They're targeted because they threaten the family system by being different, by having boundaries, or simply by existing outside the narcissist's control. The other family members aren't evil, they're enablers. They support the scapegoating because it's easier than challenging the dominant family member, or because it protects them from becoming the next target. These people are sometimes called flying monkeys, and they're often genuinely unaware of what they're doing. They believe the lies because believing is easier than confronting the truth. If you're the scapegoat, here are some things I wish someone had told me earlier. First, document everything. Keep records of conversations, save text messages, note dates and times when incidents occur. Your memory will be questioned, and having documentation makes you less vulnerable to gaslighting. Second, find people outside the family system who can validate your reality. A therapist, a friend, a support group, someone who isn't invested in maintaining the dysfunctional family dynamic. Third, set boundaries and stick to them, even when it feels impossible. You don't owe anyone access to you if they're using that access to harm you. Fourth, accept that some people will never believe you, and that's not a reflection of your worth or your truth. You can't control what others think, but you can control how much power you give their opinions. And here's the hardest truth I learned. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away. Not everyone deserves a place in your life, even if they're family. Blood doesn't justify abuse, and loyalty shouldn't require you to sacrifice your mental health. I didn't fully cut contact with Derek, but I severely limited it. I don't attend events where he'll be the center of attention. I don't engage with his attempts at reconciliation that aren't backed by genuine change. I protect my peace now, and that's not selfish. That's survival. If you're reading this, or listening to this, and you see yourself in my story, please know that you're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. You're not imagining it. Trust yourself. Trust what you know to be true, even when everyone around you is telling you you're wrong. Your reality is valid, and you deserve to be believed. Starting with believing yourself. Thank you for staying with me until the end. This wasn't an easy story to tell, but it's mine, and I'm done letting other people control the narrative. I'm curious. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Are you making dinner, driving to work, sitting up late at night, unable to sleep? I hope this story found you when you needed it, the way Marcus found me when I was ready to give up. If it resonated with you, if you felt seen or understood or a little less alone, please hit the like button. It helps other people who need this message find it, and I really want to know, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted your family at Thanksgiving, or would you have handled it differently? Tell me in the comments. Your perspectives and experiences matter, and they help build this community we're creating together. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories about people who refused to stay victims, who fought back against injustice and found their way to the other side, please subscribe to this channel. There are so many stories that need to be told, so many people whose voices have been silenced. And if you made it this far, you might also want to check out these 2 videos. There's one about a woman whose in-laws tried to steal her home, and another about a man who exposed his family's financial fraud. Both of them found justice in their own ways, just like I did. Until the next story, take care of your heart, protect your peace, and remember, you're stronger than the people who tried to break you.